So principle number one is ensure adequate light. Now, none of these are in particular order. It's a little bit not really. Now, ensure adequate light. I want you to pay attention to that. Doesn't tell you what light to have, because there's really two approaches to ensuring adequate light. Approach number one is get the light that suits the corals that you have, or approach number two is get corals that suit the light that you have. Because what I want you to understand is that corals come from shallow water, corals come from intermediate water, and corals come from deep water. So therefore, there's not necessarily the best light, because the question is, the best light for what? Because the sun is about 550,000 Kelvin, 5,500 Kelvin. And so that's what beams down onto the land. Then as soon as you start going under the water, you start to lose a lot of the colours in the spectrum. So red is gone after about 3 metres. Then as we go further down, more and more colours are lost. So therefore the colour, or colour temperature, or Kelvin rating of the light that the corals receive change. And blue is the main colour that penetrates water. And blue is the main colour that penetrates sky. That's why is the sky blue? Because blue is the penetrator. Why is the ocean blue? Because blue is the colour that penetrates. As soon as light is not present, of course it goes to black. But blue is the main spectrum. That's why with our aquarium lighting we have to be particularly concerned about the amount of blue in our spectrum. So a shallow water coral is receiving quite low Kelvin rating, but a very high luminal lux. So that's the intensity. It's a very intense light, but the actual colour of it, or the colour temperature, the Kelvin rating is very low. Whereas you've got a deep water coral, if it's deep enough water, it doesn't even require light at all. So therefore you can have a beautiful thriving reef aquarium and not have a light at all, just by having deep water corals, by having sponges, by having thistle corals, sun corals, and all the beautiful corals that are actually non-photosynthetic. And in saying that, I want you to remember too that the coral is actually an animal. The coral is not a plant. But inside this coral, there's a relationship between the coral and various what's called zooantheles, type of algae. And this algae that grows inside the coral uses the light energy and converts it to basic sugars that then the coral can use for its energy. So that little relationship, the coral provides the algae with a place to live, with carbon dioxide, with excrement, and so there's a beautiful little relationship that occurs. And also when the coral, let's say something goes wrong with the coral and it expels out its algae, which it's possible of doing, the coral essentially goes white. Because the colour of the coral is governed by the zooanthele, which is the little algae that grows in the coral, and also the various pigments which grow in response to the zooanthele, which is in the corals. And also little bacteria live inside the corals, and there's a whole relationship that occurs there. So what we're getting at is ensure adequate light. So you'll hear on the internet and you'll hear people swearing, you must have this light, you must have that light, you must have this light. But the question I want you asking is the right light for what? So once again, two things to look at. Number one, get the right corals for the tank that you have, or get the right lights or the right situation for the corals that you want, if that makes sense. The next thing I want you to understand is that there's shallow, medium, and deep water corals, and therefore that will also govern where you position the corals in your aquarium. Because what I want you to think, and this has not been proven, but I want you to consider that every centimetre you go down in the aquarium in ratio to the light from your aquarium might be equivalent to each centimetre you go down in the ocean in relevance to the intensity of the sun. So therefore, if you have a shallow water coral that's right at the top of the aquarium, straight under the light, it's going to get much higher intensity as it would in the wild. Whereas if you put the coral right down the bottom, the light has had to go through this much water, which means that, that it's not receiving anywhere near as much intensity as a coral that's on the surface. So the question is really, here's your fish tank, here's the lighting that you have, where does this coral go? So should I put it up here? Should I put it down there? Should I put it wherever? And so the first thing you want to do is have a good reference, because remembering that corals come from shallow water and corals come from deep water. There are various things that give it away. The colour of the coral will give it away, that will just be a guide, and the shape of the coral will be a guide. For example, your brain corals and those sorts of corals, when they grow flat, they are usually found quite deep. Exactly the same species in the shallow will be very round. Others will be very spiky. So the actual shape of the coral gives you a hint. But if I can give you any advice at all in regards to where do you start, in regards to where do you put your corals, I would say get a book called A Practical Guide to Corals by Julian Sprung. I think we've got some copies at the moment. If not, we can just order them there, no problem. They're about $100, $90 around there. And it's wonderful because it shows you each coral, it shows you how to say the name, which is a nice thing, and it also shows you where to position the coral. He actually shows you on a reef where he would put it, and he gives you fairly accurately how much light it requires, and how much water flow it requires, and how aggressive it is, and how easy it is to keep, which is really valuable information, because you take your coral home, okay, I'm going to get a cataphilia, for example, and you check your little reference guide, and it says, okay, well, it needs a medium to high amount of light, so straight away you know you're going to want to put it in this sort of area, and then it might say it wants a medium to high amount of flow, so then you will know where to put it in reference to the flow, and then it will also tell you how easy the coral is to keep, which is a really good thing, particularly before you buy the coral, because some corals are extremely hard to keep, and other corals are very easy to keep. Yep?
Just a question, with your deeper corals, if you keep them at the top of the tank, will they suffer as a result?
Usually not, but it would depend on the amount of lighting. So the other way around is more important. So basically, if you keep a deep water coral up near close to the light, it is possible of it bleaching. Because if it's getting too much light, it will close up and it will often shed a lot of its colour. And so therefore, that can be a concern if you have very high intensity lighting. In most circumstances, with most people's aquariums, it's not going to be the case. So that is a great point, but you're much more concerned about making sure shallow water corals are at the top than you are making sure deep water corals are at the bottom. So deep water corals you can consider fluffies, leathers and all the other ones that are very versatile. Those ones you can put anywhere you want. But if you're wanting to keep a shallow water one, you're very restricted to where it can be, so you're really competing for that top area, if that makes sense.
How long should lights be left on for?
Okay, everything that most of the questions I answer, straight away I'm going to reflect back to what happens in the wild. So what I want you to consider happens in the wild is in the morning the sun comes up, and while the sun is at an angle like this, your actual light penetration in regards to lumens and lux is not very high, because a large percentage of the light is actually reflecting off the water. Then, when it gets up, the sun gets up quite high, your penetration becomes very good. Then once it gets past there, all of a sudden your penetration is not so good anymore. So if you have something like metal halides, which are a high intensity light, then we're going to want 8 to 10 hours. If we have lower intensity light, such as fluorescence or so forth, then you're going to want more like 12 hours of light. So it depends on the lights. And in the perfect world, you'd have some fluorescence that would come on in the morning, then an hour or so after that your halides would come on, then your halides would go off, then your fluorescence would go off. And that's it. That's what you'd have in a perfect world. I'm not saying for 1 second you've got to do that though.